Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. I'm Alex.
I'm Eve.
This time we're going to be tackling a book that's pretty much legendary for writers and filmmakers, Robert McKee's story. Well, it's not exactly a light read, but once you start getting into these ideas about storytelling, it's really hard to stop.
Yeah, it can be a little intimidating at first, all the frameworks and everything, but there's a reason it's become so influential. I mean, it's just packed with insights that can change the way you watch movies, read books, I think even experience everyday life.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think for this deep dive, I'm excited to see what we can pull out of this.
Well, I think to start, we gotta introduce our author a little bit, Robert McKee. So he's not just a writer; he's been a screenwriter, a story consultant, but most notably, I think, a teacher. His seminars on storytelling have been super popular, attracting everybody from like huge Hollywood people, to aspiring novelists.
Right. So we're not just getting theory here; we're getting some real, battle-tested experience.
Exactly. And one of the first things he does is he challenges us to think about why stories matter so much. And he says, and I'm quoting here, "Story is a need, not a want."
Ooh, I like that. It's so simple,
Mm-hmm.
but it really kind of gets to the core of it. It's not just that we enjoy stories, we need them.
Exactly. He argues that stories help us make sense of the world in a way that other systems sometimes can't, like science or philosophy. He says, story is the most powerful tool we have to test the truth of an idea.
So it's not just about escaping reality, but it's about engaging with it.
Yeah.
It's about grappling with these bigger questions about life and meaning and our place in the universe.
Exactly. He uses a fascinating example, actually, the O.J. Simpson trial. Think about it. I mean, millions of people were glued to their TVs. Obviously, it was a celebrity case, right?
Wow.
But it tapped into all these anxieties about race and justice and the American dream.
Wow. That's a really powerful example. And it makes you realize how often, even in real life, we're turning to stories to try to understand these complex events and emotions and everything.
It's true, but here's where things get even more interesting. He argues that despite our deep-seated need for stories, storytelling today is in a state of decline.
Wait, what? How can that be? We are bombarded with stories constantly. Movies, TV shows, books, the internet.
Yeah, and that's exactly his point. He says we're drowning in content, but so much of it is shallow and formulaic. He says storytelling is in crisis because the overwhelming majority of writers, producers, executives, actors, and critics have lost or never found the abiding values of the art.
So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. We might have more stories than ever before, but are they good stories?
Yeah.
Are the stories that challenge us and move us, make us think?
Exactly. And he's very critical of what he calls anti-structure, which is a trend that he sees that rejects traditional forms and conventions in favor of, like, randomness and chaos.
He gives some pretty scathing examples, like the film Last Tango in Paris, where he describes as a mindless journey through the sewer of sex and violence.
Right. His critique is that these kinds of stories, while they might be shocking or provocative, they ultimately lack substance and meaning, like empty calories. They might entertain you for a moment, but they leave you feeling empty and unsatisfied.
So if storytelling is in decline, how do we get back on track? How do we create stories that are both entertaining and meaningful?
Well, that's where his framework comes in. He argues that storytelling is a craft. It's an art form, and it has its own set of principles and techniques that can be learned and mastered.
Okay, so it's not just about having a good idea. It's about knowing how to shape that idea into a compelling story.
Exactly. And one of the key tools that he gives us is what he calls the story triangle. And it's a way of understanding different approaches to storytelling, a kind of map of the narrative landscape.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this story triangle.
Okay, so he lays out three main approaches, arch plot, mini plot, and anti-plot. And he argues that every story, no matter how complex, no matter how unconventional, it falls somewhere within this triangle.
So it's like a spectrum of storytelling possibilities.
Exactly. So arch plot is what we often think of as classic storytelling. You've got a clear protagonist, a defined goal, series of obstacles, and a satisfying resolution. Think of movies like Star Wars or Jaws or The Godfather.
Right, those are all great examples. So it's kind of the good triumphs over evil, hero saves the day, happily ever after.
Well, not necessarily happily ever after, but there is a sense of closure, like a journey completed, a conflict resolved.
Okay, that makes sense. What about mini plot?
Mini plot, as the name suggests, is more minimalist. It often features internal conflict ambiguous endings, and a more introspective tone. Think of movies like Lost in Translation or Moonlight.
So these are stories that are more about character than plot, more about exploring those complexities of human experience than delivering a neat and tidy resolution.
Exactly. And then you have anti-plot, which is the most radical of the three. Um, Anti-plot stories often reject traditional narrative conventions altogether. They might have non-linear timelines, absurd situations, or unreliable narrators. Think of David Lynch films like Mulholland Drive or Eraserhead.
Okay, that's a pretty wide range. So how does a writer decide which approach is right for their story?
Well, he argues that the choice of approach should be driven by the story itself, by the themes you're exploring, the characters you're creating, and the emotional experience you want to evoke in the audience.
So it's not about choosing the best approach. It's about finding the approach that best serves the story you're trying to tell.
Exactly. Exactly. And he goes on to explore the nuances within each of these categories. So, for example, even within archplot, you can have variations like closed and open
Oh,
endings.
that's interesting. Can you give an example?
Sure. He contrasts the satisfying closure of a film like Paris, Texas, with the lingering ambiguity of The Accidental Tourist. So both are archplot stories, but the way they handle the ending creates a very different emotional experience for the audience.
So a closed ending ties up all the loose ends and leaves the audience feeling satisfied, while an open ending leaves some questions unanswered and allows the audience to kind of draw their own conclusions.
Exactly. And he argues that both approaches can be effective depending on the story you're telling.
This is making me think about all the movies and books I've loved and how they kind of fit into these categories.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Once you start thinking about stories in terms of the story triangle, you start to see patterns and connections that you might not have noticed before.
Okay, so we've got closed versus open endings. What other distinctions does he make within this story triangle?
Well, he also talks about the difference between external and internal conflict. And he argues that, most stories have a blend of both. But the emphasis can shift depending on the type of story you're telling.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So he contrasts the external struggles of Max and Mad Max 2 with the internal journey of the protagonist in The Accidental Tourist. So in Mad Max, the conflict is primarily external, right? Max is fighting for survival in this post-apocalyptic wasteland. He's battling villains, overcoming obstacles, trying to stay alive.
Right, it's a very visceral, action-packed kind of story.
Exactly, exactly. But then you have The Accidental Tourist, where the protagonist is grappling with grief and guilt and emotional paralysis. His journey is much more internal, right? He's trying to come to terms with his past, to reconnect with his own feelings, to find meaning in his life.
So in one story, you're rooting for the hero to overcome these external threats,
Yeah.
and the other, you're invested in the character's sort of internal transformation.
Exactly. And he argues that both types of conflict are essential to good storytelling. It's about finding the right balance for the story you're trying to tell.
This is so helpful. I'm starting to see how these different approaches can create like such different emotional experiences for the audience. What about the way a story handles time?
Right. So he also distinguishes between linear and nonlinear time. So a linear story, it unfolds in chronological order, while a nonlinear story might jump back and forth in time, creating a sense of disorientation or highlighting the cyclical nature of certain experiences.
Oh, I love movies that play with time, like Pulp Fiction or Memento.
Exactly, exactly. And he argues that the manipulation of time can be a really powerful tool for creating suspense or mystery or a sense of psychological depth.
Like you're giving the audience a puzzle to piece together.
Exactly, exactly. And he points to a film called Bad Timing as a particularly effective example of nonlinear storytelling. He says it uses time as a thematic element that expresses the lover's emotional lives.
So it's not just about being clever or experimental. It's about using that manipulation of time to deepen the emotional impact of the story.
Exactly. And he's very clear about that. He's all about intentionality in storytelling. Every choice you make, from the structure to the characters to the dialogue, it should be driven by the story you're trying to tell.
This is giving me so much to think about. I'm already starting to see stories in a whole new light.
That's the magic of his work. It gives you a language and a framework for understanding the art of storytelling.
Speaking of language, he doesn't shy away from the political dimensions of story design, does he?
Not at all. In fact, he dedicates a whole chapter to what he calls the politics of story design. He argues that art is never entirely separate from politics, and he directly addresses this in his analysis of storytelling.
Right, which makes sense. Stories reflect the values and beliefs of the people who create them, and those values are often shaped by the political and social context in which they live.
Precisely, precisely. And he takes aim at what he sees as a false dichotomy between Hollywood movies and art films, arguing that these terms are often misused. They're loaded with these implicit biases.
So he's saying it's not as simple as, Hollywood equals bad and, art films equal good.
Exactly, exactly. He argues that both Hollywood and art films can produce great stories and terrible stories, and that the real distinction lies in the worldview that each approach often embodies. He says the difference between the two is not a matter of budget or even talent. The difference is in their worldviews.
So what are those differing worldviews?
Well, he suggests that Hollywood, tends to embrace this optimistic belief in positive change, in the possibility of overcoming obstacles and achieving one's dreams, while art cinema often leans towards a more pessimistic view, emphasizing the futility of change and the cyclical nature of human suffering.
That's fascinating. It makes me think about how different cultures might gravitate towards different types of stories.
Exactly, exactly. And he doesn't take sides in this debate. He simply lays out the different perspectives and encourages the reader to think critically about the implicit messages about change and human nature that are embedded in the stories they consume.
Which is such an important point, right?
Yeah, okay.
We need to be aware of the underlying values and assumptions that shape the stories we tell and the stories we are told.
Absolutely. And that awareness can make us more discerning viewers and readers and even creators of stories.
So much to digest. I'm already feeling like I need to go back and rewatch all my favorite films with his framework in mind.
I know what you mean. And we haven't even begun to explore the richness of his ideas about character and plot and theme.
I'm ready to dive even deeper.
Yeah.
What else does he have in store for us?
Well, before we get too far out of ourselves, I think it's worth taking a closer look at some of the specific examples he uses to illustrate his points. Let's start with his analysis of Casablanca.
Oh, Casablanca, one of my
Yeah.
all-time favorites. I'm curious to hear how he breaks down such a classic film.
Yeah, he uses Casablanca as a prime example of a perfectly structured arch plot story. He says Casablanca is perhaps the most structurally perfect screenplay ever written. And he walks us through each beat of the story, highlighting how it masterfully blends, external and internal conflict, romantic and political themes, and creates a world that feels both familiar and exotic.
It's amazing how much depth there is to a film that on the surface seems like, kind of a simple love story.
Exactly, exactly. And he points out how the film's ending, while seemingly tragic, is actually incredibly hopeful. Rick, the protagonist, might lose the woman he loves, but he gains something even more profound. A sense of purpose. A renewed belief in something bigger than himself.
It's a classic example of how a character's internal transformation can be just as satisfying, if not more so than an external victory.
Precisely, precisely. And his analysis helps us to understand how the filmmakers achieved that emotional impact.
This is making me realize how much craft and intentionality goes into creating a truly great story. It's not just about having a good plot or interesting characters.
Absolutely. And he provides us with the tools to see that craft,
Yeah.
to appreciate the artistry that goes into making us laugh and cry and everything in between.
I'm starting to see the world differently. I'm noticing the underlying structures and patterns and everything. From news headlines to casual conversations.
That's the power of his work. It opens your eyes to the power of story and its pervasive influence on our lives.
Well, before we go down that rabbit hole, I think we need to take a step back and look at some of the practical tools and techniques that he offers for actually crafting a story.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these concepts can be applied to writing a screenplay or a novel or even just telling a good story, around the dinner table.
Sounds good to me. But before we go there, I think we could both use a break to process all these fascinating ideas. We'll be back soon to dive even deeper into McKee's world of story.
All right, ready to dive back into McKee's story?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm eager to hear more about kind of the practical side of things, how we can actually use these ideas to create compelling stories of our own.
Well, one of the first things that he stresses is the importance of understanding the substance of your story.
Substance. So like what it's really about. Beneath the surface plot and characters and all that.
You got it. He uses a great analogy. He says that life is constantly throwing raw material at us, experiences, emotions, events, and it's the writer's job to sift through this chaos and find those nuggets of truth that will form the foundation of their story.
I like that image. It's like panning for gold.
Yeah.
You got to sift through a lot of dirt and gravel to find those precious nuggets.
Exactly, exactly. And he believes that this process of finding the substance, it's crucial.
Yeah.
It's not just about coming up with a clever plot twist or a quirky character. He says the finest writing is that which digs out the truth.
So how do we do that? How do we find those nuggets of truth that will make our stories resonate with, readers or
Yes.
viewers?
Well, he suggests several approaches. One is to draw on your own personal experiences.
Hmm.
He's a firm believer in the idea of writing what you know, but he's also quick to point out that it's not about simply transcribing your life onto the page. He says personal experience is only raw material. You must find the universal in the personal.
So it's not about writing an autobiography. It's about using your own life as a springboard to create something bigger and more meaningful.
Exactly. Another approach he suggests is to research and immerse yourself in the world you want to write about.
Mm.
If you're writing a historical novel, delve into primary sources, letters, diaries, really try to understand the nuances of that time period.
It's about doing your homework and making sure that your story feels authentic, grounded in reality.
Exactly. He also encourages writers to explore their own memories.
Yeah.
To dig into their past and uncover those forgotten moments, those formative experiences that shaped who they are today.
It's like an archaeology of the soul. You're excavating your own past to unearth the hidden treasures that can fuel your creativity.
I love that. And speaking of excavation, he also encourages us to pay attention to the world around us, to observe people, to eavesdrop on conversations, to notice the small details, the seemingly insignificant moments that can spark a story idea.
He's saying that inspiration can come from anywhere if you're open to it.
Exactly, exactly. He has this great quote. He says, "The world is brimming with stories waiting to be discovered, but you must train yourself to notice them."
Okay, so once we've gathered all this raw material, these nuggets of truth and inspiration, how do we start building a story?
Well, that's where structure comes in. He dedicates a large chunk of story to dissecting the classic three-act structure.
Yeah.
The setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. But he also encourages writers to experiment with different forms and to find what works best for their particular story.
So he's not a slave to formula.
Yeah.
He's saying that the structure should serve the story, not the other way around.
Exactly, exactly. He's very clear about that. He says, structure should not be a blueprint, but an instrument.
Oh, okay, I like that. So let's break down those kind of essential elements of structure. The setup is where you introduce the protagonist, the world, the conflict, right?
Right. And he emphasizes the importance of creating a compelling protagonist,
Yeah.
someone the audience can root for, even if they're flawed or make mistakes. He says, give your protagonist a strong spine of desire.
So it's about creating a character who has clear goals and motivations, someone who wants something badly and who's willing to fight for it.
Exactly. And that desire, that need is what drives the story forward, It's the
Yeah.
it's the engine of the narrative.
Makes sense. And then the confrontation is where the protagonist faces a series of, obstacles and challenges that test their resolve and force them to make difficult choices.
Exactly. He
Welcome
argues
back
that
to
these
Notes of
challenges
Curiosity,
should escalate
exploring
in
ideas that
intensity.
matter.
Building towards a climax that forces the protagonist to confront their deepest fears and insecurities. He says the climax is the truth revealed, the final test in which the protagonist either rises to greatness or falls.
Okay, so the stakes are getting higher, the pressure's building, and the protagonist is being pushed to their limits.
Right. And then comes the resolution, where the protagonist either triumphs or fails, and the central conflict is resolved.
Right, and this is where he really stresses the importance of creating a satisfying resolution.
Yeah.
One that feels both earned and believable. He says, "The resolution is not a tidy package. It's the reverberation of the climax."
Hmm.
So it's not just about tying up all the loose ends. It's about leaving the audience with a sense of completion,
Yeah.
of having experienced something meaningful.
Precisely. And he argues that the ending should resonate with the theme of the story, leaving the audience with something to ponder and reflect upon.
That's a great point. I think some of the most memorable stories are the ones that leave you thinking long after you've finished reading or watching them.
Absolutely. And speaking of memorable moments, he talks about the importance of the inciting incident, that event that really kicks the story into high gear.
Like the shark attack in Jaws or the call to adventure in Star Wars.
Exactly. Those moments that disrupt the protagonist's world and set them on a journey. He argues that the inciting incident should be something that is both believable and consequential. He says the inciting incident blasts the protagonist out of their world.
It's like a catalyst that sets the whole story in motion.
Right. And from that point on, the protagonist is on a collision course with their destiny.
Okay, so we've got our substance, we've got our structure, and we've got our inciting incident. What else do we need to build a compelling story?
Well, he argues that characters are the heart of any good story. He says character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure.
And he's very specific about, how to create characters that are both, believable and memorable.
Mm.
He emphasizes that characters should be revealed through their actions, not through exposition or description.
He has a brilliant quote about this. He says, "Tell me what the character does, and I'll tell you who he eyes."
I love that. It's so true. It's not about telling the audience what a character is like. It's about showing them,
Yeah.
through their actions, their choices, their reactions to the events of the story.
Exactly, exactly. And he argues that the best characters are those who are complex and believable, and capable of change. They should have both strengths and weaknesses, virtues and flaws. He says the more the writer understands the contradictions of human nature, the deeper the characters and story.
So it's about creating characters who are multidimensional, who are capable of surprising us, who feel like real people, even if they're fictional.
Right. And he talks about the importance of giving characters clear goals and obstacles. He says a protagonist without a goal is like a car without an engine. You can sit in it all day, but it's not going anywhere.
So every character should have something that they're striving for, something they want to achieve, even if it's something small or seemingly insignificant.
Exactly, exactly. And those goals should be challenged by obstacles, both internal and external.
He also stresses the importance of creating conflict between characters. He says conflict is the lifeblood of drama.
Yeah. He encourages writers to create characters who challenge each other, who force each other to grow and change, and who ultimately, reveal each other's true natures.
Like those classic buddy cop movies where the two partners are constantly butting heads, but ultimately they learn to respect and rely on each other.
That's a great example, and he talks about the importance of character arcs, the way that characters change and evolve over the course of the story. He says, growth is the protagonist's journey from the lie he believes in to the truth he discovers.
So it's not just about creating static characters who stay the same throughout the story. It's about creating characters who are capable of, transformation,
Right.
who learn and grow from their experiences.
Precisely, precisely. And those transformations can be subtle or dramatic, internal or external, but they should be meaningful and believable.
Okay, so we've got our characters figured out. What about the world they inhabit? How much detail do we need to provide about the setting and context of the story?
Well, he argues that the world of the story is just as important as the characters who inhabit it. He encourages writers to create worlds that are rich in detail, that feel authentic and lived in,
Yeah.
and that contribute to the overall mood and tone of the story.
He talks about world building as an essential part of storytelling.
Right.
It's not just about describing the physical setting. It's about creating a whole culture, a history, a set of rules and beliefs that govern the way people live and interact in that world.
Yeah. And he argues that the world of the story should be more than just a backdrop. It should be an active force in the story,
Yeah.
shaping the characters' choices choices and influencing the course of events.
He used the example of The Godfather to illustrate this point. You know, the world of organized crime with its own code of conduct and hierarchy, it becomes a character in itself.
Exactly, exactly. He writes, setting is more than backdrop, setting is story. And he argues that the more specific and detailed you make your world, the more believable and engaging your story will be.
So it's not about, dumping a bunch of information on the reader. It's about weaving those details into the story organically.
Yeah.
Using them to reveal character or create atmosphere or advance the plot.
Right, right. And he emphasizes the importance of using all five senses to create a vivid and immersive experience for the reader. He says, don't just tell me it's hot, make me feel the heat.
It's about bringing the world of the story to life.
Yeah.
Making the reader feel like they're right there in the middle of the action, experiencing the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, textures of that world.
Exactly. And he goes on to talk about the importance of theme, which he defines as the meaning of the story, the underlying idea or message that the story is exploring.
So it's not just about what happens in the story, it's about what the story is about on a deeper level.
Right. He encourages writers to find a theme that they're passionate about and to explore it in a nuanced and thought-provoking way. He says, a theme is not a thesis. It's a story's ultimate meaning expressed through the interplay of its constituent elements.
So the theme shouldn't feel like, a moral lesson tacked on at the end. It should emerge organically from the story itself. Through the character's actions and choices and through the way that the story unfolds.
Exactly. And he believes that the best stories are those that explore complex and universal themes, love, loss, betrayal, redemption, the search for meaning, the nature of good and evil.
Those are the big questions that have fascinated humans for centuries.
Yeah.
It makes sense that they would be at the heart of great storytelling.
Right. And he also talks about the importance of subtext, that layer of meaning that lies beneath the surface of the story. He says subtext is what lies beneath the surface of dialogue, action, image, in other words, beneath everything.
So it's what's not being said explicitly, but what's being implied or suggested through the character's actions and words.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like an iceberg. What you see on the surface is just a small part of the whole story. The real meaning lies beneath the surface.
Yeah.
In the unspoken depths.
Ooh, like that?
Yeah. And he encourages writers to layer their stories with subtext, to create a sense of mystery and intrigue that will keep the audience guessing and engaged.
He also talks about the importance of symbolism, right? Using objects or images or actions to represent abstract ideas or concepts.
Yeah. He argues that symbolism can be a powerful tool for adding depth and meaning to a story, but he also cautions against using it in a heavy-handed or obvious way. He says, symbolism must be subtle and suggestive, not explicit or didactic.
So the symbols should feel organic to the story. Not like they're being forced on the reader.
Right. He uses the example of the rosebud sled in Citizen Kane. It's not just a random object. It represents, Kane's lost innocence and his longing for a simpler time. But the meaning isn't spelled out for the audience. It's up to them to interpret the symbol and its significance within the context of the story.
That's such a great example, and it makes you realize how much thought and care goes into crafting a truly great story. It's not just about having a good plot or interesting characters. It's about creating a whole world, a whole universe of meaning that resonates with the audience on multiple levels.
Absolutely, and he provides a roadmap for that journey. A set of tools and techniques that can help any writer, no matter their level of experience, to create stories that are both compelling and meaningful.
Well, speaking of tools and techniques, I know he also goes into the nuts and bolts of storytelling.
Yeah.
Like dialogue and pacing and point of view. Should we delve into that now, or do you think we've had enough brain food for one sitting?
I think we've covered a lot of ground already. Maybe it's time for a breather before we tackle those finer points of the craft.
All right, let's take a break, grab a coffee, and we'll come back to the final stretch of our deep dive into story. All right, so we're back and ready for the final stretch of our deep dive into story by Robert McKee. We've talked a lot about the big picture stuff like the story triangle and, character and theme and all that, but McKee really gets into the nuts and bolts of the craft too.
Yeah, he does. And one of the things that really struck me is how much he emphasizes the importance of the process of writing. He doesn't just give you a set of rules and say, okay, go write a great story.
Yeah.
He talks about the discipline involved, and the rewriting and finding your voice as a storyteller.
He really seems to see it as both an art and a craft,
Mm.
like something that requires both talent and hard work.
Absolutely. He says a writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people.
Huh. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Sometimes it does feel like pulling teeth, but there's also something so rewarding about this struggle,
Yeah.
like wrestling with these words and ideas until you finally get it right.
Exactly. And he gives a lot of practical advice for navigating that process. Like he talks about setting aside time to write every day, even if it's just for an hour or two. Find a space where you can work without distractions and create a routine that helps you stay focused and productive.
He also talks about the value of outlining, right? Planning out your story before you actually sit down to write it.
He does. He does. He argues that outlining can save you a lot of time and frustration in the long run. He says every writer has to find the approach that works best for him. But if you're a writer who's never outlined, I urge you to try it at least once.
So he's not saying that everybody has to outline, but at least give it a shot. See it works for you.
Exactly. But whether you outline or not, he stresses the importance of rewriting, revising and refining your work until it's the best it can be. And get feedback from trusted readers. Be open to constructive criticism.
I can be tough though. Right?
Yeah,
I like putting your work out there, opening yourself up to critique.
Yeah, it definitely can be. But he argues that it's an essential part of the process. He says every writer needs an editor. An editor is someone who helps us realize the story we truly want to tell, not just the story we think we want to tell.
That's a great way to put it. Sometimes we get so close to our own work that we can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
We need that outside eye to help us see those flaws and that potential that we might be missing.
Exactly. And he talks about, the importance of finding your own voice as a storyteller.
Mm.
Developing a style that's unique and authentic to you.
He seems to have a real aversion to formulaic storytelling, to those tired tropes and cliches that we see recycled over and over again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He wants writers to be bold, to take risks, to break the rules if it serves the story. He says the more you imitate, the less you create. Don't be a Xerox machine. Be an original.
It's about using those tools and techniques to create something truly unique, something expressive, something that reflects your own vision as a storyteller.
Exactly. And I think that brings us back to the idea of the story triangle, which we discussed earlier. Remember, he argues that all stories, no matter how different they seem on the surface, they fall somewhere within this triangle, which represents a spectrum of storytelling approaches.
Right. We talked about arch plot and mini plot and anti-plot, but it seems like, most stories don't fit neatly into one category.
Right. And he's not suggesting that these are rigid or prescriptive categories. It's more about, understanding the principles that underlie each approach and then using those principles to create your own unique blend.
So a story might have, elements of arch plot with a clear protagonist and a driving goal, but also elements of mini plot with a focus on internal conflict or an ambiguous ending.
Exactly. Or a story might be, primarily an anti-plot, but with a strong central character and a sense of purpose. He encourages writers to be playful and experimental, to find their own place within this spectrum of storytelling possibilities.
It's not about following a formula. It's about using those techniques and principles to tell the story that only you can tell.
Right. He says, you must write the story that burns within you, not the story you think will sell.
I love that. That's such a powerful message. Write the story that matters to you, the story that you're passionate about, and let the chips fall where they may.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that he offers in story, a sense of permission, a sense of empowerment. He's saying you have a story to tell, and here are the tools to help you tell it in the most effective and meaningful way possible.
Well, this has been an incredibly stimulating deep dive. Story is a dense book, but it's so full of insights. It's definitely one I'll be coming back to again and again.
I agree. I agree. It's one of those books that can change the way you see the world,
Right.
Not just the world of stories, but the world itself.
And I think one of the key takeaways for me is that, storytelling it's not just about entertainment. It's about making sense of the world, connecting with others, exploring the depths of human experience.
He reminds us that stories have power, the power to move us, to challenge us, to inspire us, to help us understand ourselves and each other a little bit better.
So if you're looking for a book that will challenge you and inspire you and help you to become a better storyteller, I highly recommend Story by Robert McKee.
It's an investment for sure, but it's an investment that will pay off for years to come.
That's it for this deep dive.
This is Alex and Eve.
We'll be back next time with another fascinating book and another thought-provoking conversation.
Until then, happy reading.